83. The collapse of Russia and the intervention of the United States. The withdrawal of Russia, revolution, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The first great governmental victim of the First World War was the Russian Empire. As the Russo-Japanese War had led to the revolution of 1905 in Russia, so the more ruinous conflict in Europe led to the far greater revolution of 1917. The story of the Russian Revolution is told in the following chapter. It is enough to say here that war offered a prolonged test that the Tsarist government could not meet. Bungling, dishonest, and secretive, incapable of supplying the material required for 1273 modern fighting, driving hordes of peasants into battle, in some cases even without rifles, losing men by the millions, yet offering no goal to inspire sacrifice, the Tsarist regime lost the loyalty of all elements of its people. In March 1917, the troops in St. Petersburg mutinied, while strikes and riots desolated the city. The Duma, or Russian parliament, used the occasion to press its demands for reform, which the Tsarist government was unwilling and unable to address. On March 15th, Nicholas II abdicated. A provisional government took over, made up of liberal noblemen and middle-class leaders, generally Democrats and constitutionalists, with at first only one socialist. The provisional government held power from March to November 1917. Its members, who shared in the liberalism of Western Europe, believed that a liberal and parliamentary regime could not succeed in Russia unless the German Empire were defeated. They took steps, therefore, to prosecute the war with a new vigor. In July 1917, a new offensive was opened, but the demoralized Russian armies again collapsed. The provisional government, the mass of the Russian people, would no longer support a war in which they were asked to suffer so much for so little. Nor did Russian peasants or workers feel any enthusiasm for the European-style intellectuals and professional men who headed the Provisional 723 government. Ordinary Russians, insofar as they held clear political views, were mostly drawn to one or another of numerous forms of socialism, Marxist and non-Marxist. The Russian Marxist Party, the Social Democrats, was divided between Menshevik and Bolshevik factions, the latter being more radical. The Bolshevik leaders had for some time lived as exiles in Western Europe. Their principal spokesman, V.I. Lenin, with a few others, had spent the war years in Switzerland. In April 1917, the German government offered safe passage to Lenin through Germany to Russia. A railway car full of Bolsheviks, carefully sealed to prevent infection of Germany, was thus hauled by a German train to the frontier, 1274, whence it passed on to St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, as the city was renamed during the war. The aim of the Germans in this affair, as in the sending of Roger Casement to Ireland in a submarine, was of course to undermine the enemy's home front. It was to promote rebellion against the provisional government, and thus at last to eliminate Russia from the war. The Bolsheviks returned from exile. The position of the provisional government became rapidly more untenable until by November 1917, the situation was so confused that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were able to seize power. The Bolsheviks stood for peace with Germany, partly to win popular favor in Russia, and partly because they regarded the war as a struggle among capitalist, imperialist powers that should be left to exhaust and destroy each other for the benefit of socialism. On December 3rd, 1917, a peace conference opened between the Bolsheviks and the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. Meanwhile, the peoples within the western border of the old Russia, Poles, Ukrainians, Bessarabians, Estonians, Latvians, Finns, with German backing, proclaimed their national independence. The Bolsheviks, because they would not or could not fight, were obliged to sign with Germany a treaty to which they vehemently objected, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of March 3rd, 1918. By this treaty, they acknowledged the independence, or at least the loss to Russia, of Poland, Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic provinces. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. For the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk represented their maximum success during the First World War. Not only had they neutralized Russia, they also now dominated Eastern Europe through political puppets placed at the head of the new independent states. A certain number of German troops remained in the east to preserve the new arrangements. But it was no longer a two-front war. Masses of the 1275 German army were shifted from east to west. The High Command, under the leadership of Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff since August 1916, prepared to launch a final assault in France to end the war in 1918. The year 1918 was essentially a race to see whether American aid could reach Europe soon enough, in sufficient amount, to offset the added strength that Germany drew from the collapse of Russia. In March of that year, the Germans, beginning with gas attacks and a bombardment by 6,000 artillery pieces, opened a formidable offensive, before which the French and British both recoiled. On May 30th, 1918, the Germans again stood at the Marne, 37 miles from Paris. There were still only 2 American divisions in action in France, though the United States had been at war for over a year. At this point in the story of the Great War, there are therefore 2 open questions: how the United States entered the war and the length of time required for the buildup of its forces overseas. American intervention. The United States and the war. We have seen how President Wilson clung persistently to neutrality. The American people were divided, in part because of their diverse historical connections with Europe. Many had been born in Europe, or 7 in 24 were the children of immigrants. Those of Irish origin were anti-British. Those of German origin were often sympathetic to Germany. On the other hand, since the time of the Spanish-American and Boer Wars, a noticeable current of friendliness to the English had been running stronger than ever before in American history. The sale of war material to the Allies and the purchase of the bonds of Allied governments had given certain limited, though influential circles a material interest in an Allied victory. American idealism was on the side of England and France, insofar as it was not isolationist. An Allied victory would affirm and advance the cause of democracy, freedom, and progress far more than a victory of the 1276 German Empire. On the other hand, England and France were suspected of somewhat self-interested imperial motives, and they were allied with the Russian autocracy, the reactionary and brutal Tsardom. America divided us. The fall of Tsarism made a great impression. Democrats and progressives now came forward even in Russia. No one had heard of Lenin or could foresee the Bolshevik Revolution. It seemed in the spring of 1917 that Russia was struggling along the political path that England, France, and America had already taken. An ideological barrier had dropped away, and the demand for American intervention to safeguard democracy became more insistent. The Germans gave up the attempt to keep the United States out. Constricted ever more tightly by the blockade and failing to get a decision on land, the German government and high command listened more readily to the submarine experts, who declared that if given a free hand, they could force British surrender in 6 months. Civilian and diplomatic members of the government objected, fearing the consequences of war with the United States. They were overruled. It was a good example of the way in which, in Germany, the Army and Navy had taken the highest policy into their hands. Unrestricted submarine warfare was to be resumed on February 1st, 1917. It was foreseen that the United States would declare war, but the German High Command believed that this would make no immediate difference. They estimated in 1917, correctly, that there would be about a year between the time when the United States entered a European war and the time when it could take part with its own army. Meanwhile, the planners said, in 6 months they could force Britain to accept defeat. Unrestricted submarine warfare at 1277, on January 31st, 1917, the Germans notified Wilson of the resumption of unrestricted submarine attacks. They announced that they would sink on sight all merchant vessels found in a zone around the British Isles or in the Mediterranean. Wilson broke off diplomatic relations and ordered the arming of American freighters. Meanwhile, the publication of the Zimmermann telegram convinced many Americans of German aggressiveness. German secret agents also had been at work in America, fomenting strikes and causing explosions in factories engaged in the manufacture of munitions for the Allies. In February and March, several American ships were sunk. Americans regarded all these activities as an interference with their rights as neutrals. Wilson at last concluded that Germany was a menace. Having made his decision, he now saw a clear-cut issue between right and wrong. Wilson obtained a rousing declaration of war from Congress on April 6th, 1917, and the United States went to war against Germany to make the world safe for democracy. To make the world safe for democracy. At first, the German submarine campaign realized and even exceeded the predictions of its sponsors. In February 1917, the Germans sank 540,000 tons of shipping. In March, 578,000 tons. April, as the days grew longer, 874,000 tons. Something akin to terror seized the government in London. Britain was reduced to a 6-week reserve of food. Gradually, countermeasures were developed. Mine barges, hydrophones, depth charges, airplane reconnaissance, and most of all, the convoy. It was found that 100 or more freighters together, though all had to steam at the pace of the slowest, could be protected 725 by a sufficient concentration of warships to keep submarines away. The United States Navy, which, unlike the Army, was of considerable size and ready for combat, supplied enough additional force to the Allies to make convoying and other anti-submarine measures highly effective. By the end, 1278 of 1917, the submarine was no more than a nuisance. For the Germans, the Great Plan ultimately produced the anticipated penalty without the reward. Its net result was only to add America to their enemies. On the Western Front in 1917, while the Americans desperately mobilized for the war they had entered, the French and British continued to hold the line. The French, finding in General Nivelle, a commander who still believed in the breakthrough, launched an offensive so unsuccessful and so bloody that mutiny spread through the French army. Pétain replaced Nivelle and restored discipline to the exhausted and disillusioned soldiers, but he had no thought of further attack. "I am waiting for the Americans and the tanks," he said. The British then assumed the main burden. For 3 months, late in 1917, they fought the dismal Battle of Passchendaele. They advanced 5 miles near Ypres at a cost of 400,000 men. At the very end of 1917, the British surprised the Germans with a raid by 380 tanks, which penetrated deep into the German lines, but were obliged to withdraw because no reserve of fresh infantry was at hand to exploit their success. The French and British hold the line. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarians, strongly reinforced by German troops, overwhelmed the Italians in a decisive victory at the Battle of Caporetto. The Central Powers streamed into northern Italy, but the Italians, with British and French reinforcements, were able to hold the line. The net effect of the campaigns of 1917 and of the repulse of the German submarine offensive was to re-emphasize the stalemate in Europe, incline the weary Allies to await the Americans, and give the Americans what they most needed: time. The Americans made good use of the time given them. Conscription, which was democratically called selective service, was adopted immediately after the declaration of war. The United States Army, whose professionals in 1916 numbered only 130,000, performed the mammoth feat of turning over 3.5 million civilians into soldiers. With the Navy, the United States came to have over 4 million in its armed services, which 12s and 79 may be compared with over 12 million in the Second World War. Aid flowed to the Allies in Europe. To the loans already made through private bankers were added some $10 billion lent by the American government itself. The Allies used the money mainly to buy food and munitions in the United States. American farms and factories, which had already prospered by selling to the Allies during the period of neutrality, now broke all records for production. Civilian industry was converted to war uses. Radiator factories turned out guns, and piano factories manufactured airplane wings. Every possible means was employed to build up ocean shipping, without which neither American supplies nor American armies could reach the theater of war. Available shipping was increased from 1 million to 10 million tons. America mobilizes for war. Civilian consumption was drastically reduced. 8,000 tons of steel were saved in the manufacture of women's corsets, and 75,000 tons of tin were spared in the making of children's toy wagons. Every week, people observed Meatless Tuesday, and sugar was rationed. Daylight saving time, invented in Europe during the war, was introduced to save coal. By such means, the United States made enormous stocks available for its European allies as well as itself, though for some items, notably airplanes and artillery ammunition, The American armies, when they reached France, drew heavily on British and French manufactures. The deepening involvement in Europe's Great War therefore pushed the United States to develop a more active national government and to collaborate more closely than ever before with the Western European states and peoples. The 726, the final phase of the war, 1280, the Germans, as we have seen, victorious in the east, opened a great final offensive in the west in the spring of 1918, hoping to force a decision before American participation turned the balance forever. To oppose the new German assault, a unity of command was achieved for the first time when a French general, Ferdinand Foch, was made commander-in-chief of all Allied forces in France, with the national commanders subordinate to him, including Pershing for the Americans. In June, the Germans first made contact with American troops in significant force, meeting the 2nd Division at Château Thierry. The German position was so favorable that civilians in the German government thought it opportune to make a last effort at a compromise peace. The military, headed by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, successfully blocked any such attempts. They preferred one final gamble. The German armies reached their farthest advance on July 15th along the Marne. There were now 9 American divisions in the Allied line. Foch used them to spearhead his counterattack on July 18th. The badly overstrained Germans began to falter. Over 250,000 American troops were now landing in France every month. The final Allied offensive that opened in September, with American troops in the Argonne occupying an eastern sector, proved more than the Germans could withstand. The German High Command notified its government that it could not win the war. The German Foreign Office made peace overtures to President Wilson. An armistice was arranged, and on November 11, 1918, firing ceased on the Western Front. The armistice, because Germany's allies had surrendered during the preceding weeks, the deadly, grinding battles were finally over. But the war continued to affect almost every aspect of European politics and society. The horror it brought to individual lives cannot be told by statistics, which dryly report that almost 10 million men had been killed and 20 million had been wounded. Each of the European great powers, except Italy, lost from 1 million to 2 million in killed alone. The United States, with some 330,181 casualties of all types, of whom 115,000 died, lost in the entire war. Fewer men than the main combatants had lost in single battles, such as Verdun or Passchendaele. But American assistance was decisive in the defeat of Germany. It came late in the war, when the others had been struggling for almost 4 years, so that the mere beginnings of American military action were enough to turn the scale. On the date of the armistice, there were 2 million American soldiers in France, and another million were on the way. But the American army had really been in combat only 4 months. During the whole year of 1918, out of every 100 artillery shells that were fired by the 3 Allied armies, the French fired 51. The British fired 43, and the Americans fired only 6. Casualties of war. The war was thus less costly for the United States than for any of the other major military powers. About 50,000 Americans were killed in battle. Most other deaths were caused by disease, including the deadly influenza epidemic of 1918, which killed as many as 43,000 U.S. soldiers over several months. The horrible toll of military deaths in all countries during the World War was actually far surpassed in 1918 to 1919 by the worldwide influenza pandemic that caused at least 50 million deaths across the globe. A virulent new strain of virus, called the Spanish flu, was the source of the disease, which became one of the most deadly pandemics in all of world history, and deepened the profound sense of loss that affected people everywhere after the Great War. 727, 1282, these soldiers were in 2 of the American divisions that served in France during 1917 to 1918. Most American soldiers did not arrive in Europe until 1918, and they were segregated into white and black military units. The fresh troops from the United States enabled the Allied commanders to launch a decisive final offensive, forced the German commanders to recognize that Germany could not win the war, and contributed to America's expanding involvement in all aspects of modern European history. Left, Holton Archive, Getty Images. Right, PhotoQuest, Archive Photos, Getty Images. 84. The collapse of the Austrian and German empires. The war proved as fatal to the German and Austro-Hungarian empires as to the Russian. The subject nationalities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the national councils representing them in the Western capitals, obtained recognition from the Allies, and in October 1918 declared their independence. The last Habsburg emperor, Charles I, abdicated on November 12th, and on the next day Austria was proclaimed a republic, as was Hungary in the following week. Before any peace conference could convene, the new states of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and enlarged Romania, a republic in Hungary, and a miniature republic in Austria were in existence by their own action. Nationalities gain independence. The German Empire stood solid until the closing weeks. Liberals, Democrats, and socialists had lately begun to press for peace and democratization. Yet, it was the High Command itself that precipitated the debacle. In the last years of the war, dictatorial powers had become concentrated in the hands of General Ludendorff, and in September 1918, only he and his closest military associates realized that the German cause was hopeless. On September 29th, at Supreme Headquarters at Spa in Belgium, Ludendorff informed the Kaiser that Germany must ask for peace. He urged that a new government be formed in Berlin, reflecting the majority in the Reichstag on democratic parliamentary principles. 1283, in calling for immediate peace negotiations, Ludendorff seems to have had two ideas in mind. First, he might win time to regroup his armies and prepare a new offensive. Or if collapse became unavoidable, then the army would not be blamed for the defeat, because the civilian or democratic elements would be the groups in Germany that sued for peace. The liberal Prince Max of Baden was recruited to head a cabinet in which even socialists were included. In October, various reforms were enacted. The Bismarckian system was ended, and Germany became a liberal constitutional monarchy. These changes served the purpose of Ludendorff and other generals because the German military caste at the 728 moment of Germany's crisis was more eager to save the army than to save the empire. The army must never admit surrender. Emperor, high command, officers, and aristocrats were frantically unloading the now humiliating tasks of surrender upon civilians. President Wilson unwittingly played into their hands. Speaking now as the chief of the Allied coalition, the one to whom peace overtures were first made, he insisted that the German government must become more democratic. It may be recalled how Bismarck, after defeating France in 1871, demanded a general election in France before making peace. Wilson, unlike Bismarck, really believed in democracy, but in a practical way, his position was the same. He wanted to be sure that he was dealing with the German people rather than with a discredited elite. He wanted the broader German nation to apply for and accept the Allied terms. In Germany, as realization of the military disaster spread, many people began to regard the Kaiser as an obstacle to peace. Or they believed that Germany would obtain better terms if it appeared before the Allies as a republic. Even the officer corps, to halt the fighting before the army disintegrated, began to talk of abdication. The socialists threatened to withdraw from the newly formed cabinet, that is, go into opposition and end the representative nature of the new government, unless William II abdicated. A general strike led by minority socialists and syndicalists began on November 9th. Abdication, Prince Max told the emperor, is a dreadful thing, but a government without the socialists would be a worse 1284 danger for the country. William II abdicated on November 9th and slipped across the frontier into Holland, where despite cries to try him as a war criminal, he lived quietly until his death in 1941. Germany was proclaimed a republic on the day he abdicated. 2 days later, the war stopped. Democracy in Germany. The fall of the empire in Germany, with the consequent adoption of the republic, did not arise from deep revolutionary action or change of basic sentiment in the German people. It was an episode of the war. The Republic, soon called the Weimar Republic, arose because the victorious enemy demanded it, because the German people craved peace, because they wished to avoid forcible revolution, and because the old German military class, to save its face and its future strength, wished at least temporarily to be excused from its previous role in the German government. When the war ended, the German army was still in France, its discipline and organization still apparently unimpaired. No hostile shot had been fired on German soil. It was said later, by some, that the army had not been defeated, that it had been stabbed in the back by a dissolving civilian home front. This was untrue, but the myth became popular among many post-war German nationalists. It was actually the panic-stricken Ludendorff who first cried for democracy, but the circumstances in which the German Republic originated made its later history, and hence all later history, very troubled.